listening to the Jboy Show, your number one source for Auburn and the SEC.
My goal was to run through his soul and grab his heart when I run through his soul. Kurt, Nate, Coach Staff, those are memories.
I think we've established ourselves as, I think, the premier conference in college football.
Now, the SEC is better at the top. It's better in the middle.
The Southeastern Conference remains the premier conference.
Takes the snap. Looking for the receiver. He's got Lutz and Kirkland. Touchdown, Auburn!
Think about it. It's always been the SEC and everybody else trying to catch it.
I think this is probably the best league from a competitive venue standpoint.
Capable teams. You just look at those programs, the way they recruit, how they invest.
Snap to Burrow. 3 steps. Fires. Back corner of the end zone. Over the shoulder catch. Did he hold on? He did. Justin Jefferson. Touchdown, Tigers.
And now, your host, Jboy.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Jboy Show. Very excited to bring in another special guest. You know him from TigerDetails.com. It's Jimmy D. Smith, the publisher of Tiger Details. He's also the founder of the LA Bootleggers and the 3-time, get this right, the 3-time mullet toss champion. Jimmy, what's up, man?
I must say, I think I'm more proud of the 3-time mullet toss champion than anything else you could attach.
It's like I told you. I mean, you're a Hall of Famer, man. You're a first ballot mullet toss Hall of Famer. I don't know anybody else who's won it more than once. That's pretty impressive.
Yeah, actually rolled out there. Used to see my uncle do it all the time, and got a little older and rolled out there towards the end of a competition when I was 16. That was my first time.
Nice.
So they let me in late. I missed the registration, but they let me in late. And I had one of the last throws, and half the crowd had already cleared out, and I ripped it.
Just let it ride.
And let it ride, and went back the next year, and this time I was stoked and ready for it, of course. And so I went out there and threw early and then watched people try to catch it all day, and they weren't able to catch it. So, yeah, I was proud of it, man. It was something my family were very competitive. So I got to see all my uncles do it for years.
Yeah.
Kind of waiting my turn. And I have to be honest, I don't think any of them thought I had any chance in hell.
Hey, man.
Until I did.
It's one of the greatest underdog stories in sports.
Yeah, it is. I'm telling you, it's historic.
That's hilarious.
It'll live on forever.
That's hilarious. That's absolutely hilarious. So, like I told you in the pre-show, man, I had to get that in there. But gonna start with a little LSU recruiting here. As it sits today, they've got 16 total commitments. I'm talking about the Rivals rankings here. They've got 16 total commitments. They're ranked 9th in the team recruiting rankings. And in on it for some big-time guys, there's one I want to talk about specifically. But right now, Jimmy, what do you think of the class coming off a national championship, and how do you feel LSU's doing using that momentum?
Yeah, I think they've done a good job. I think COVID's thrown a curveball on everybody's recruiting process here, and I think they're a little further behind with some kids they really hope to have in at this point. Or better yet, they may be leaders for some of those kids, but they really hope they'd have them on board in March and April. And so they're chasing some of these guys as are other programs. But when you address it by the impact players at the need positions that they're putting together in this class, I mean, it's a really solid haul. I would think by year's end they would have more momentum to get some of these top 5-star caliber guys that would push them up those recruiting rankings. But the foundation's there for a really, really strong class. They're in a really good position with some in-state recruits that'll help bolster those rankings as well. So I think they've done a good job capitalizing on that momentum. And really, when you look at this class, what we're used to seeing in LSU classes is a Louisiana heavy draw, right? I mean, build the borders around Louisiana, supplement it with a few kids here and there from other states. This has become a national recruiting class with some Louisiana kids mixed in it. And it's just kind of shown the evolution of the program under Ed Orgeron and how he's trying to promote that national brand, which he sees LSU as. And whether they're winning championships or not, they are, because we can all recognize a slew of LSU players that have been successful in college and the NFL. I think they might still lead the the NFL and most college kids on rosters. So, it's just kind of changed, but the foundation's there for a great class, and I expect them to finish very strong when things are over with.
Yeah, and you actually, that was my next question. I'm looking at the commit list now, and you see, Michigan, Texas, California, everywhere, Virginia, so Maryland with Greg Penn, the linebacker from up there. So you really, like you said, see that national brand expanding. Not like there wasn't one before, but it's just getting, a steroid shot after the season that was put together by LSU last year. And specifically, a guy that, to me, I turn on his tape, and I personally think he's the best defensive tackle in the country in this class, and that's Mason Smith. What do you think? Obviously, he's from Homa, LSU guy. We haven't predicted going to LSU. I know you guys did a great feature on him the other day that you can catch on your website, but kind of how do you feel that recruitment's going?
Yeah, it would be a big blow for Ed Orgeron to lose Mason Smith.
Yeah.
Ed Orgeron, defensive line coach for 30-plus years, right? Bayou boy. He's from the Bayou parishes, not far from where Mason Smith's from. His mom still lives in the area. This is an area that he grew up in, so you would think Ed Orgeron would have the inside track here, and he does. But there's a lot of competition, and Mason's certainly not ready to throw all his eggs in anyone's basket. So he's still looking at a lot of these programs, and it's from East Coast to West Coast and everybody in between. Georgia's still in the mix, USC still in the mix, but ultimately, it might be LSU's to lose. I think they've had the edge for quite some time here, but you better believe there's a lot of pressure on it. Ed Orgeron's putting a lot of pressure on himself to reel this one, and this is a big fish in his own backyard, and you definitely don't want to lose kids from Louisiana to SEC foes, and some of those schools are in the mix for Mason Smith.
Yeah, and it's one, like you said, that's right in the backyard, literally, for Ed Orgeron. But it's something too where you look around Alabama, you know what's going to happen. They've gotten hot lately. Marching up the rankings. They got Damon Payne yesterday, a couple days ago. My thing, and looking around, if you look at Auburn, where they're at right now, how do you see kind of the SEC West recruiting right now, Jimmy? As you're a guy I know that keeps track of more than just LSU. What are you kind of seeing around it, and with this COVID situation, just how crazy it is?
Yeah, it's really changed a lot. I think. When you look at schools that usually come into Louisiana and challenge LSU for some of these kids, whether it be Auburn, Alabama, and some of these other programs, they're just not able to make that push that they often make with some of these guys in the spring. And so I think schools are really leaning on guys in their backyards and really hitting home the guys that they had the inside track on early. You haven't seen much change and much shift. If they got on a kid in February, they aren't taking a lead for that kid. So it's who were you recruiting? Who were you in a good position with 10 months ago, 8 months ago? And who's in your backyard that's comfortable, that's been to your program? Out of LSU 16 commitments, only one never visited the school.
Yeah.
And that's got to be a concern for LSU moving forward, right? When visits open back up, and now he's visiting LSU and these other schools for the first time, how will that change things down the road? So COVID's thrown a wrench in this for everybody. Alabama's getting really hot right now. Auburn's one of those schools that's really reliant on that family atmosphere on these visits. Yeah. And so when you take that away from a school like Auburn, I think that really hinders their ability to recruit at a high level, but they're doing well right now. But, until things open up, I think a lot of those schools are really going to struggle. And when you look across Ole Miss, Mississippi State, I think Mississippi State never expect them to make a push for a top 10 recruiting class. That's just not their style. But they are going to find the guys that fit Leach's system. And they're going to recruit well. When I look at the guys that they're recruiting, I'm finding pieces that fit what they're going to do and holes on that roster. So I think they're doing a good job. But there's a lot for these schools to work out here. And until visits open up, a lot of these schools are handcuffed. If you're not Auburn, if you're not Alabama, you're not LSU, you're not Clemson, you're not Georgia. There's only a handful of schools right now that could go out and convince a kid to commit to a school he's only been to once, if at all.
Yeah, and it's something that's just so different. Like you said, it's so against the routine, and I think obviously once visits open back up, I think you'll see more decommitments than you've ever seen, followed by probably more commitments than you've ever seen in some weird recruiting vacuum. But I want to talk about some on the field stuff, Jimmy, while we're looking at it, and again, assuming I think we're going to play, I think the attendance is going to be something that is minimal. The out of conference games, I hope they go to the +1 deal. But I'm looking at it, and everybody seems to say, okay, it's a Florida-Georgia dogfight in the East, which I believe, and it's Alabama and then a dogfight behind them in the West. Mac Jones has got to prove it to me first. I think he's as unproven as anybody. But how do you kind of see the West right now?
Yeah, I don't. I think it's going to be nip and tuck with Alabama and LSU again this year. I do. LSU had a lot of people jump to the NFL, but that was a deep program. And they've got impact players on both sides of the ball. They're some of the best in the country. And as many questions as I have about Miles Brennan, right, replacing Joe Burrow, we have those same questions in Tuscaloosa. And perhaps Bo Nix and Auburn are in the best position of all as far as returning quarterbacks. And I think this is where spring football might really alter some things here and the lack thereof. I mean, you were breaking in new quarterbacks to a lot of these schools around the country, Alabama, LSU particularly here, and they didn't have that time to develop perhaps that chemistry, that timing with their receivers. I mean, they're trying to get in the fall here, but there's a lot of things that go into preparing for the fall season in the spring that those schools didn't have. So I would think a school like Auburn with Bo Nix returning in the same system and so on. I know Chad Morris is there now, but they're going to work in some things. It's the same stuff for them, and they might have an advantage in that regard. But I still think LSU and Alabama are the cream of the crop, the two most talented teams in the West. And I think it's everyone else. I don't think Alabama's a step ahead of LSU. They might be a nudge ahead of LSU, but it takes more of that to really separate yourself in the SEC West. I don't think it's number one, number two. I almost see a 1A, 1B type scenario there with those two at top.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point. The way I'm kind of looking at it is not having spring. It hurts everybody, but it hurts them in a different way. And for example, you brought up the quarterbacks, and to me, that's the one spot where that would not want to be the problem I would be dealt. Like for Auburn's example, it's the offensive line. They really could have used that for experience, continuity, gelling. But you do have a quarterback like Bo Nix. You have guys returning on defense. Yeah, you lose Derek Brown, Marlon Davidson, but Auburn defense, just like LSU, it'll always be good defense. That's what they're known for, really. But, at the end of the day, I'm looking at the schedule. And, LSU from November 7th to November 28th, I mean, it is their own kind of amen corner, as the Auburn family calls it. You got Alabama at home on the 7th, South Carolina at home on the 14th, at Auburn on the 21st, and then at A&M on the 28th. So, Auburn's kind of got UMass if they play that game a week before. It's at Auburn. I think that may be a game, and Jimmy, I think you may agree with me here that could decide, who wins the West or who competes with Alabama to win the West, because Auburn's got Alabama that next week.
Yeah, absolutely, and ultimately, anytime you're talking about the SEC West and the top teams, maybe perhaps the playoffs and the championships beyond.
Yeah,
a one-loss LSU, one-loss Auburn.
That's a great point.
Alabama.
That's a great point.
Should still be in a good position to go beyond even the SEC championship game. So, that's always that row for LSU. Those last 4 or 5 weeks of the season, there's always a crunch of games that really make or break their season. And to think that, if they were to get through Texas and their whole schedule leading up to that run, that could be the make or break game for them. I mean, if they were to fall to an Alabama but still beat an Auburn, they're still in a very strong position. They're still in a position to somewhat control their own destiny.
You're exactly right.
To getting to that 14 playoff, especially as the reigning champion. Nobody's going to keep an LSU team, a one-loss LSU team, to an Alabama out of the Final Four, even if they're not playing in the SEC championship game. So that's going to be a huge stretch of games, and I would say that Auburn game is crucial this year, as important as any on that schedule. And it's going to be a tough ball game. Those two teams always play tough ball.
Always. It was a war last year. I thought Auburn defensively, they ran that 3-man front, but when you have Derek Brown, you can do things like that. Georgia tried to emulate it and got absolutely ripped to shreds. I remember watching that attempt. But, another team in the West that I want to talk about, Jimmy, that we haven't, and they're getting all the hype. I swear I feel like they always do, is a team that LSU is very familiar with, and that's Texas A&M over in College Station. And, I'm having Phil Steele on next week, and he has them, preseason ranked 5th. I know there's a lot of high-profile people expecting a lot of things. I'm not. I think it's going to be normal Texas A&M plus one more win. So kind of how do you see it, and how do you feel about Kellen Mond?
Yeah, I think, I don't know if the rest of that team is good enough for Mond to be somewhat inconsistent. Right. And that's the thing. Like when you look at the teams that have come out of the SEC West, that usually are on top. Their defenses are powerhouses. They have great running games. They have different elements of their team that can really carry a quarterback at times. LSU is always a contender and had horrible quarterback play. Until recently, Alabama didn't have a lot of great quarterbacks.
No, that's true. They could turn around and hand the ball off. That's all they needed to do.
Right, and play great defense.
Yeah.
I think Texas A&M has some players on defense. I don't think they've got quite enough in that front seven to be dominant.
I agree.
Week after week, and I just don't know if Mond is going to be consistent enough to carry that team. I'm kind of with you. I think I'm looking at this team as, over-under on wins, 8.5, 9 wins. I think that's the kind of team they have there at Texas A&M. I know a lot of people are thinking they're going to take that next step. Until they do, I'm just maybe not quite sold.
Yeah,
I mean, LSU came in with a chip on their shoulder last year against that team and really took it to them. And you mean to tell me Texas A&M closed that gap by 40 points?
No.
I just don't see it. So
I don't either. And if you look at the big games, I mean, they scored 20 against Auburn, but you look at who else they played that was worth their salt. They couldn't get anything going offensively. And on defense, they got to be able to stop people in big games. It's amazing. I never hear, that Texas A&M, they're expected to do this well because the defense is supposed to be so good. Like you said, it's the defense coming out of the SEC. You have to be, and that's what the SEC East had to adjust to, in my opinion, is defensively they had to catch up with what the West was doing just because it was so dominant. But, looking if we do it, and I'm going to throw a hypothetical to you, Jimmy, as we kind of wrap up right here. So let's say, and we do have conference-only schedules with a +1, right? So I guess it's really not a conference-only schedule. I love the way they phrase that. But you have a +1, like, for example, Auburn and North Carolina. So you play one game out of conference. You're in the SEC. You either, in my opinion, have to automatically give the SEC 2 spots because it's that strong of a conference, or you have to expand the playoff to 8 teams this year. What do you see if we get that conference +1 type format?
Yeah, I think that's really and it's interesting you said that because I've thought that and I've not really heard anyone else say it. I think that really handcuffs the SEC more than any other conference. I mean, and then with the +1s, the SEC often puts together some of the tougher out of conference schedules too. I mean, there's a couple, don't get me wrong, there's a couple, Prairie Views in there and so on, but like LSU has Texas this year.
Yeah.
To open the season, and I think Alabama's got a big contest early in the season too, and there's even talks that they might substitute it with a Notre Dame or something.
Yeah, it's USC, and I've heard Notre Dame, I've heard BYU, which I think would be interesting, but it seems to me that you're right. It handcuffs the SEC the most because you're playing against you will play the toughest schedules the whole year, hands down, and that nobody can argue that.
Yeah, let's say LSU plays 8 games, right? I think they're 7 or 8 conference games, whatever, and they're +1. So you're looking at Florida, Alabama, Auburn, Texas A&M, Mississippi State, Ole Miss, Texas, and Arkansas. That's LSU's schedule. There's only 1, maybe 2 easy wins. Would you say Arkansas and Ole Miss, and maybe Mississippi State?
Maybe.
Other than that, I mean, you've got some really tough ball games ahead of you. They cross over and play Florida, so I'm imagining they'd keep that game locked in with the conference schedule. So, I mean, that's a brutal schedule, and then to think that a team like, and I'd hate to drag in other conferences, but Clemson might play who? Yeah. What is their schedule going to look like at the end of 8 weeks playing conference foes? and to think that they would get as much as many people in that playoff would be a difficult pill for the SEC to swallow, no doubt about it.
Yeah, and if whatever metric they keep strength of schedule, you're really going to see if it's true or not on ESPN or whatever when it pops up at the end of the year, because it should be unbelievably slanted if that's what happens, and it's trending toward that way. But last question, and we have Jimmy D. Smith here from TigerDetails.com. Make sure you check that out. That's LSU's rival site. I want to ask you, who do you think? Right now, I know it's early and I know it's crazy, and if you don't know, you can dismiss the question. But who do you think signs the number one class, and where do you think LSU finishes in the rivals team rankings?
I'll start with LSU because that's what I know best. I would think LSU finishes with the top 5 class here. Yeah, with guys like Mason Smith lining up, and Brian Thomas, a top 100 recruit in their backyard at wide receiver, and Tristan Lee, 5-star, 4-star, depending on where you look, lining up at offensive tackle. It's going to be hard for LSU not to make the top 5. But when you start the way it's been now, there was a noticeable difference between the first and second class, and then maybe fourth and fifth, right? The gap now is tightened with schools like Georgia recruiting at an extremely high level, and Clemson and Ohio State and LSU and Alabama. So, if you're top 5, you have a chance of being number 2. If you're aiming for number 1, you have a chance of falling to number 5. I don't see a school like Tennessee staying on top of the rankings. I just don't. They have a ton of commitments right now. A lot of people are going to pass them in time. I don't think Oregon's going to hold on to a top 5 type class. I think Ohio State's by far in the best position right now to finish number 1 because of their consensus 5-star commitments, and they still have room for plenty more. But I think Alabama, they're starting their surge now. You mentioned it earlier in the segment. I think Alabama's going to start pushing. I think Georgia's going to make another push. They seem to be lining up. They've made late pushes year after year. They're way back in the rankings right now, but I expect them to make a push. So I think you're going to look at a lot of the same names finishing in the top group. I think Ohio State probably finishes number 1 with LSU somewhere between 3 and 6.
I think that's a great projection. I actually forgot. I would get killed if I didn't ask you this, Jimmy, especially from the Auburn fan base and Alabama fan base. It seems like a 3-team battle. It is a 3-team battle for JaQuincy McKinstry, a.k.a. Kool-Aid, 5-star on 247. He's being recruited, obviously, to play basketball and football. He's a kid that kind of keeps it close to the vest. We haven't put out a prediction on it yet. How does LSU feel about Kool-Aid right now?
Yeah, I'm going to tell you, LSU's never overly confident going into the state of Alabama for a kid that Auburn and Alabama really want, right? So they've had cautious optimism is how I would describe it throughout this whole process. There was one point they thought they'd lead. And so when I asked, this was earlier in the spring before the shutdown, so when I asked the source, do you think that results in the signing? He said, well, if I had to put my money on it, no. And so it just kind of to show you, we think we lead. We think we lead with the parents at this moment. This was probably back in February. Do you think you end up signing them? No.
Yeah.
So that's just kind of where it's at. And we were actually talking about this as a staff a little while ago is, we noticed that he is talking to Alabama and Auburn a lot about basketball. He's having very few conversations with Will Wade.
Yeah, I've heard that. Jimmy, you're not the only person that's told me that. And I'm wondering, and again, I don't want to hold you too long. If you got to go, let me know. But is there not a disconnect, but how is it with Will Wade and Ed Orgeron? And I know, LSU's kind of got that off the court stuff going with basketball. If that's hindered it, I don't know. But is that something where Will Wade's not super interested in him playing basketball?
I'm not really sure. I've seen LSU's historically had a lot of 2-sport athletes. Yeah. Whether it be track, football, baseball and football, baseball and basketball, basketball and football. We've seen them all cross over. And we even saw one last year, Jalen Cook, a local kid from Louisiana, signed with LSU that plays both sports, but will probably only play basketball in college. But, I think the connection's there, but for whatever reason, it just hasn't taken off yet. Perhaps Will Wade doesn't see room in his class, so he doesn't think it's a viable option, or I'm not really sure. Those conversations just don't seem to be are taking place as they are with Alabama and Auburn. And at the end of the day, if the kid's really serious about playing two sports, that's going to, all but eliminate LSU. So, I think it's important to figure out from our perspective as our staff at Tiger Details, how interested is he playing in basketball? And if that interest level is truly really high, like you kind of think it is, LSU's probably on the outside looking in at this moment, But
definitely.
As football program, everything else aside, I feel like LSU might have a slight edge. But ultimately, it looks like there's going to be more at play, and it's really hard to pry an Alabama-Auburn target from that state.
Yeah, and it's vice versa going into Louisiana. It's always a dogfight. And the good thing about LSU is you're really the only school in Louisiana, so you're not having to fist fight your brother, but and especially as much talent comes out of that state, it's unreal. You go anywhere and they can play. But Jimmy, I really appreciate you coming on, man. I'd love to have you back on, especially hopefully once we get playing and can have some stuff on the field to talk about and obviously the recruiting stuff. But please, again, tell everybody where they can find you because you do a hell of a job, man.
Yeah, you can find me at tigerdetails.com. I'm at Jimmy Detail on Twitter. We are the LSU rival service. And you can find me July 4th weekend on Perdido Beach Coast throwing mullets.
Yeah. That's a great point. That's a great circle back to he's the 3-time mullet toss champion. I told him he's the Joey Chestnut of mullet toss. But Jimmy, great stuff, man. I know we'll talk again. Stay safe out there, and I'm looking forward to the future.
Absolutely. Take care.
That was Jimmy Smith from TigerDetails.com. That's LSU's rival service. Does a really good job. Some really interesting notes there on Kool-Aid at the end. I thought it was a great look kind of into LSU's class, kind of what they're seeing around them. Talked about some on-the-field stuff. Obviously, LSU is going to be really confident going into next season. They have a ton of talent. I believe it's going to be a fist fight at the top of the West, like I told you, between Auburn, Alabama, and LSU. And I think Texas A&M is going to sneak somebody out of that 3 in a game, and you just kind of hope to be the team that avoids that punch. But again, as usual, thank you guys. Remember, you can find us on Twitter and Instagram at The Jboy Show. Shout out to IBN, the best PR team in the game. Shout out to Faison in the studio doing his thing. Y'all are the best. Remember, text JBOY to 90407 and you get the earliest predictions. That's another edition of The Jboy Show, and Jboy's gone.